Hello everybody and welcome to the first of these Castle Howard online talks in these very strange times. The reasoning behind this is that at the moment you may not be able to come to us, but through the wonders of technology and the wizardry of my colleague Matt Collier, we can come to you. So the first talk I'm going to give this week is on the Castle Howard landscape. Halfway along the 5 Mile Avenue that forms the dramatic approach to Castle Howard stands the Obelisk, built by John Vanbrugh in 1714, signalling the head of the drive that leads down to the house. In 1731, Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle, added 2 sets of inscriptions for the base of the 70-foot shaft. The first, in Latin, commemorated the victories of the Duke of Marlborough. The second, on the west side and in English, was a more personal statement, and the inscription opened with a conditional speculation. If to perfection these plantations rise, if they agreeably my heirs surprise, this faithful pillar will their age declare. And the lines concluded by memorializing the great building achievements of Carlisle with his architects Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. Charles, the 3rd Earl of Carlisle, of the family of the Howards, erected a castle where the old castle of Henderskelf stood, and called it Castle Howard. He likewise made the plantations in this park and all the outworks, monuments, and other plantations belonging to the said seat. Well, looking up and down the avenue from the Obelisk, it's easy to see what Carlisle meant by the word plantations, which he used 3 times in the text. The long columns of trees planted along the border of the road. But great swathes of trees stretched elsewhere across the entire estate, either along geometrical axes or in blocks of existing ancient woodland. By 1727, the date of this estate map in the top of the screen, many of these trees planted in the first decade of the 18th century would still have been young. But in woodlands such as Rainwood, Prettywood and Mount Zion, the trees would have been mature or at very least semi-mature. And these blocks of woodland, which I'm marking out with the cursor here on the map, here and here and here and here, these actually correspond remarkably closely to how they look today. So this is Rainwood, this is Mount Zion, this is that crescent-shaped wood just below the Mausoleum, i.e. here, and this is the edge of Prettywood. So these plantations have remained remarkably intact. But in his inscription, Carlisle was commemorating what we might call the green fashioning of Castle Howard, the introduction of new schemes or the shaping of existing plantations with rides, walkways and other features. Of course, these great tracts of woodland would also in time constitute a valuable cash crop for his descendants. Oak, beech, lime, or similar hardwoods could be harvested for their timber, anything from 80 to 120 years and upwards after their planting. So the inscription is written with dynastic and economic posterity in mind. Today, the plantations Carlisle spoke of so confidently continue to surprise in an agreeable manner. The 9,000-acre estate divides roughly into 5,000 acres farmland, 2,000 acres woodland, and 2,000 acres of gardens, lakes, and immediate parkland. Although most of the woods have at some point been felled and replanted, this early 18th century design remains remarkably intact. I've begun the talk with trees, but let's look at another kind of planting, one that accompanied these extensive forestry operations in the first half of the 18th century. This is when Carlisle, Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor planted this corner of Yorkshire with a mass of architectural and sculptural delights, which acting in concert with the grand mansion and the natural terrain, the very contours of the Howardian hills, its trees, waterways and open parkland, produced a sublime landscape. Much of What we recognize as the 18th century core of this extraordinary building and landscaping project was completed in just over 4 decades, beginning in 1699 and more or less finished by 1740. Today, we can marvel at this accomplishment in much the same way as Carlyle's contemporaries did. But how did it all come about? Carlyle's project was indeed an extraordinary transformation of the Yorkshire landscape, and we can begin to see this by turning to an estate map of 1694, before any work on Castle Howard began. In the top left, you'll see the full extent of the map. On the right-hand side, you'll see a close-up where the old castle is marked in red, and this is the outline of Rainwood to the east of the house. Now, if we go in even closer, you will see the extent of the village and castle of Henderskelf at this time. We see the castle marked in red on an east-west axis, a rectangular building with 2 protruding wings and a sort of forecourt and gate piers here to the west. The old village itself follows the course of this yellow road, which then diverts around the castle compound, passing the church that straddles the grounds of the castle, and then comes down on the eastern side, continuing in an easterly direction at the foot of Rainwood. This is the old village of Henderskelf, and you'll see marked in rather little quaint representations of the dwellings and the landholdings attached to each one. Well, virtually all of this was to be erased in the next decade or so. And one of the human consequences of Carlyle's decision to transform his home and the surrounding landscape was the displacement of the village and its inhabitants. And today, the only trace of that village high street at the foot of Rainwood is the terrace that leads southeast from the house to Vanbrugh's temple. This follows the route of that old main street. Carlyle's first choice of architect was William Talman on the left here. But after dismissing him in the summer of 1699, he turned to his fellow Kit Kat Club member, John Vanbrugh, who proposed a bolder and more exciting design for the house, which appealed to the ambitious Carlyle. And Vanbrugh also repositioned the building, which was to have very important consequences for the layout of the grounds. Now, from this early moment, there date a pair of garden designs which show the respective Talman and Vanbrugh house positionings, together with proposals for formal gardens. And both plans are attributed to George London, nurseryman and leading garden designer of the day, someone renowned for his formal garden designs with intricate geometry, a style that owed much to prevailing French and Dutch influences. The first proposal accompanies Talman's house plan, and here we can see in detail Talman's house on an east-west axis, just as the old Henderskelf castle was, with a courtyard and gate piers here at the western side. But the house is looking in this westerly direction. This means it would not have looked directly over this rather intricate arrangement of ponds and plantings to the north of the building. To the south are a series of parterres or geometric compartments. Again, these would have been on the side of the house. A couple of other things to notice about this plan is, first of all, how Rainwood would have been carved up quite substantially into a series of straight walkways and rides, and these would have intersected with other rides at the house itself. And then to the southwest was a proposed model village that would have absorbed the inhabitants of the old village of Henderskelf. Now, the second plan with a Vanbrugh house shows it on a north-south axis. So the building has been swiveled 90 degrees. And this time, the house, with a footprint that is recognizably like Castle Howard as we know it today, is looking directly over a slightly different configuration of canals and plantings to the north. To the south, there is an area no doubt intended for parterres, which again would have been able to be seen directly from the back of the house. To the east, Raewood has been left relatively intact, but carved into a star-shaped set of rides and walkways. And again, to the southwest, one has another version of the proposed model village. And had either of these George London proposals been executed, then the early landscape at Castle Howard might have looked similar to some of the views that will appear in that great English compendium of houses, Britannia Illustrata, first published in 1707, with 80 double-page plates of bird's-eye views of houses. On the top left, we have Chatsworth, on the bottom right, Longleat. And these show houses surrounded by grand compartments of formal and geometrical enclosures aligned axially with the house. But this was not to happen at Castle Howard, where a more innovative garden layout was favoured, experimenting with the surrounding landscape in different ways. The gardens and grounds were unanimously praised for ushering in a new and more natural kind of gardening, very different from the gardens influenced by the continental manner. And it's to Raewood, to the east of the house, that we must look in these early years of the 18th century for evidence of a revolution in taste, as this ancient woodland was transformed into an exciting garden filled with architectural and sculptural features. And clearly, one of the reasons why Raewood was the first area to be developed was because it was removed from the immediate vicinity of the new mansion, which to begin with was little more than a vast construction site. Now, an early sketch of the ground to the northeast of the house, seen in the bottom left here, shows the outline of Raewood, with a bastion wall, which I'm tracing here, begun in 1703, and with entrance piers erected in 1705. And marked out in the wood, in a cursory way, are the beginnings of a sequence of straight walkways punctuated by circular openings. And this preliminary sketch suggests a semi-formal pattern of paths, avoiding the strict geometry of George London's early proposals. However, at some point, these walkways developed into a mazy and irregular network of paths, praised by the contemporary garden writer Stephen Switzer as a labyrinth diverting model. And the only record we have of this scheme is how they appear in an attenuated form in an estate map of 1773 at the top of the screen here on the left. But a sense of their intricacy can be seen from two other later photographs, aerial images. On the bottom left, this is Raewood today in winter, when the trees are not in leaf, and one can begin to see the tracery of these pathways in the woodland itself. And more revealing is a direct overhead shot from 1940 as part of the OS mapping of the UK at that time. And this shows the paths in a very clear pattern once Raewood had been clear felled. These pathways were so intricate that there's a famous incident when members of the Howard family, once at the beginning of the 19th century, became lost in the wood and had to be rescued by their servants. Now we know that the openings in Raewood at this time were varied in shape, some circular, others square, and one even diamond-shaped, all designed to generate surprise and impact as the pedestrian would have emerged from the winding paths into each clearing filled with features, either sculpted or planted or a mixture of both. And their impact can be gauged by looking at contemporary French examples here, on the left from Versailles and on the right from Chateau Marly, these openings in bosquets or wooded gardens as they were known. And we also know that in the wood at this time, Hawksmoor was responsible for designing much of the sophisticated waterworks that graced the wood, with fountains, cascades, and waterfalls, as we can see in this drawing in his hand, which has recently been discovered at Wilton House. And so this is a wonderful evocation of how the landscape looked in Raewood in the early 18th century. And the important thing to realize is that Raewood was not a densely planted area of new growth. it was a combination of ancient woodland with large mature trees of various species and no doubt some newer plantings. And taken together, all these features, sculpture, buildings, waterworks, vegetation, would have combined to present a theatre of incident in Ray Wood. Each turn of the paths would have presented a new spectacle, generating surprising or familiar sights, depending on which route one took through the wood. And a profusion of lead sculptures populated the wood. The figures that survive today were relocated later when the ensemble of waterworks, pavilions and sculpture fell into decay in the middle of the 18th century inside the wood. But one of the most admired figures was not made of lead, however. This was Apollo holding his lyre and standing on a large ornate pedestal, and both were carved by the Huguenot craftsman Henri Nadold. Now, originally, the statue and pedestal were located in Ray Wood, but today the piece is sited at the end of the Lime Walk to the south of the house, having been moved there in the 19th century. And the detailed carving on the base particularly elicited widespread admiration from observant visitors. John Tracy Atkins, visiting in 1732, declared it one of the prettiest things I ever saw. The basis at a distance seems a rude heap of stone, but when you come nearer, you may see in it all the variety of prospect that the country can afford. Villages, rocks, mountains, cataracts of water rolling down, and everything that can be viewed beautiful in a landscape, carved on each side of it. And today, all this detail is remarkably crisp and visible, although it's surprising how many people fail to spot it, assuming that this carved base is just a rude heap of stone. But this wonderful depiction of landscape is surely Mount Olympus with Apollo on the summit. Well, Carlyle's purchases of statues continued into the 1720s. In the archives, there is a bill of 1723 from Andrew Carpenter, supplying 4 figures: Hercules, a Spartan boy, a sitting Venus, and a faun. And accompanying the bill also was an important list of all the other figures that Carpenter could supply from his yard, along with their prices. Now, this was the era when lead sculptures could be purchased virtually off the shelf at a relatively low cost, especially when compared with the price of an individual commission, say in bronze or marble. And along with the temple terrace, as we see on the right here, the south parterre became the major assembly point for much of this sculpture. And in 1725, the famous bird's eye view of the house and grounds appeared in the 3rd volume of Vitruvius Britannicus. This image is, of course, an idealized one, for the house was unfinished at this time. It still lacked the west wing, as we see here, and the corresponding service block to the west. But the area behind the house also was fashioned in a slightly different manner, as we can see from this detail in a 1727 estate map. It does confirm that the symmetrical wilderness made out of fir trees was installed to the south of the house, but the lawn area immediately behind the house was configured in a different way to how we see it in the engraving. And today, an aerial view will confirm how the wilderness was actually installed, although it had disappeared by the middle of the 18th century. And this view of the ghostly outline of the boundary walls, you can see from an aerial photograph from the 1970s when the field had been ploughed over in winter. And the red arrows point to the walls that marked the edge of the wilderness. The map also records at this time a dense arrangement of 6 statues, 4 obelisks, a large column, and numerous urns and vases ornamenting the grass parterre immediately behind the house. And some of these are just visible in a painting by an unknown artist of about 1750, which is not at Castle Howard, and which shows in this detail in the bottom right, you can see a series of raised grass platforms. And we see 2 of the 4 obelisks, some of the statues and some of the urns. And indeed, in the distance in this painting, we can see the temple and the mausoleum beyond the South Lake. This is an invaluable glimpse of how the grounds to the south of the house looked in the 18th century. Well, the pedestrian experience at Castle Howard is exhilarating. The terrain is varied and extensive. There are lawns, terraces, woodlands, waterways, sculpture, monuments, and prime views across great distances. This is landscape design on a heroic scale. 2 particular features signaled to one another across the landscape. First, Vanbrugh's Temple of Diana, located at the southeast corner of the wood, built in the 1720s and nowadays known as the Temple of the Four Winds. It owes its form to Andrea Palladio's famous 16th century Villa Rotonda at Vicenza on the bottom right here. The similarities are striking, especially when the buildings are viewed from the same angle, slightly below and to one side. Each is essentially a cube with a dome and 4 porticos on each elevation and decorated with pediments and on the corners above. Well, the temple was designed as a pavilion in which to take refreshment or pursue leisure activities. And the interior was decorated with scagliola by the Italian stuccoist Francesco Vasari, but was not completed until 1739. And busts of Roman emperors and empresses rest in these rather unusual circular recesses above the doors. And the dome itself is gilded with plasterwork. A quarter of a mile away once stood Hawksmoor's Temple of Venus, dating from the early 1730s. And it was an open rotunda with 8 columns supporting a heavy entablature with a rather chunky lead-lined cap on top. And the weight of this superstructure was clearly enormous. And as the stone decayed from rusting iron cramps and water and frost damage, the structure became less and less stable. So by the 1930s, the time of this photograph here on the left, we can see that the temple was beginning to collapse, had to be shored up with timber, and the bastion below it was also collapsing. The statue of Venus, as we can see from the picture on the right, was relocated at this time inside the walled garden. And a few years later, the temple disappeared, deliberately flattened by a tree during the clear felling of Rainwood in the Second World War. And today, just the base remains. This has been cleared of vegetation, and we can see the original octagonal footprint on this bastion that juts out into the parkland. Well, Vanbrugh's temple and Hawksmoor's temple answered one another. Architecturally, one was square and enclosed, the other round and open. And here we see them lining the eastern border of Rainwood, and they would have acted as eye catchers, one to the other, from their respective platforms. But Carlyle was planting the landscape even further afield during these decades. Dating from the late 1720s is the first of the mock fortification walls the visitor encounters on the approach along the avenue from the south. The Carmire Gate by Hawksmoor, with its chunky arch, heavy keystones, Gothic crenellations, and polygonal turrets at either end of the curtain wall. And it serves as a prelude to Vanbrugh's Pyramid Gatehouse, a mile further along the avenue, erected initially in 1719 as simply a pyramid arch, but the wings were added later in the 1750s by Sir Thomas Robinson. And then stretching out either side of the gatehouse for half a mile east and west are the mock fortifications, which began in the 1720s. And we can see here the gatehouse in this aerial view straddling the avenue, and then stretching out to the west and stretching out to the east are the walls, punctuated with bastions and turrets. And these not only recall the medieval walls of Chester, Vanbragh's early hometown, but of course also the walls of nearby York, and too, the walls of ancient Rome, as we see in the bottom right, which themselves were punctuated by turrets, towers, bastions, and pyramids. And the pyramid motif was to be extended along this ridge at Castle Howard, in particular by Hawksmoor, with his own large pyramid situated to the east of the Pyramid Gatehouse. And this pyramid of 1728 is set on a low square plinth and flanked by 4 pairs of angled piers. And inside it's hollow. The corbelled interior contains a bust of the 3rd Earl's 3 times great-grandfather, Lord William Howard, the Tudor founder of this branch of the family. And then there is the final structure planted in the landscape, the grandest monument of them all, Hawksmoor's Mausoleum, begun in 1729. But like so much at Castle Howard, it's the result of incremental progress. What is really extraordinary about the 18th century landscape here is that it grows in an organic and integrated fashion. There was no master plan, no great blueprint drawn up in, say, 1700 with a schedule of works set out. The monuments build upon one another, fueled in part by the tremendously creative, competitive dynamic between Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor. One man offers a temple. A few years later, the other does. One man builds mock medieval walls, so does the other shortly afterwards. One sites a pyramid in the landscape, 10 years later, so does the other. It's therefore wholly logical that the siting of the mausoleum on the natural promontory of Mount Zion Hill should have been accompanied in the 1730s by the widening of a small stream known as now New River, a serpentine river fashioned out of a small stream into this broad river stretch. And in 1740, it will receive its own bridge, New River Bridge. And most people believe this bridge to be a folly. It comes from nowhere and it goes nowhere. But this is not so. In fact, it forms the principal access route to the mausoleum. Carriages would process in a circuitous route from Castle Howard to the south and emerge from the adjacent roadway over the bridge and ride up to the mausoleum. And this is how the coffin and the entourage would travel to the moment of interment inside the building. As for the building itself, it evolved through a number of design stages and influences before its finished form was agreed upon. It drew on Roman buildings, both ancient and recent, including on the left Bramante's Tempietto, and on the right the tomb of Gallienus on the Appian Way. At one point we know that Carlyle requested a colonnade instead of the proposed arcade, and so Hawksmoor supplied him with a comparative elevation and plan. You can see that the net effect of the colonnade was to heighten the building quite considerably. And the edifice was designed to rest on a small square plinth and therefore be seen to rise dramatically from out of the landscape at the top of that hill. Well, the final version of the mausoleum, completed after Hawksmoor's death in 1737, bore only a partial resemblance to his vision of the building. The steps on the eastern side, we can see at the bottom left here, a heavy but practical addition, were added at the suggestion of Lord Burlington. And the bastion wall that surrounds the building was built by Daniel Garrett in the early 1740s. And together they rather undid Hawksmoor's intended effect of a cylindrical building thrusting out of the hilltop. Well, today it is possible to finesse this view with the contours of the land from certain angles. And this is a view taken from further east, which hides the bastion wall, and you get the sense of this vertical structure thrusting out of the hilltop. Inside the building, on the upper level, is the chapel, lit by large windows and a clerestory some 70 feet high. Carved rosettes decorate the ceiling, modelled on the Pantheon in Rome. And the 8 fluted Corinthian columns in the chapel are fully recessed, and they respond to the 20 Doric columns of the colonnade outside. But perhaps the ultimate confirmation of Carlyle's dynastic aspirations lies in the fact that the mausoleum is still, today, the private burial place of the Howard family. Beneath the chapel is the crypt, with a central vaulted chamber linked to a circular passageway around the perimeter. And from this issue 4 sub-chambers. And the catacombs contain 63 niches or loculi, less than half of which are filled. Realizing that his public star had waned long ago, Carlyle determined to raise the most comprehensive monument possible, an entire landscape that would dwarf the ephemeral glories of political life and last well beyond his own lifetime. In the early decades of the century, Carlyle transformed the sleepy village of Henderskelf into a unified domain, the huge, sophisticated, landscaped environment of Castle Howard, as marked out in that map of 1727. And even the name, Castle Howard, conflates territorial, architectural, and dynastic aspirations. And there can be no doubt that whatever the disappointments Carlyle suffered in his public career, his decision to refashion this corner of England in his own image was an enduring success. And this returns us to the inscription on the obelisk, recording a vision and a determination that would ensure all these plantings endured. The house, the monuments, the very family itself, and of course, the wider designed landscape. Consequently, Castle Howard has to be understood as a totality. The buildings in relation to the landscape and vice versa. We miss the breadth of that early vision if we consider each component in isolation. The unity of the built and the natural heritage is key to its meaning. And of course, whilst all this was going on, the avenue with its new plantations was slowly maturing in a quiet way, as it still does today after extensive restoration work in recent years. What remains, of course, is the most spectacular backdrop for arriving at and departing from Castle Howard. Created in the 18th century, it is the most memorable landscape in Britain. Of course, much was to happen in later centuries, and the landscape continues to evolve today. But that is a subject for another talk. So thank you for listening. I'm now going to hand back to my colleague Matt, who will coordinate questions that you might want to ask in the light of this presentation. So over to you, Matt. Yes, the first questions I've got to hand was from Gail. Thank you for that. You asked whether the monuments were the ideas of the architects involved and how much the Earl was involved, or indeed others. The answer to that is not a simple one. I mean, I think we always credit 3 men principally with building Castle Howard: the Earl himself, Vanbrugh, and Hawksmoor. These were the principal players. But certainly with the later design of the landscape, and particularly the mausoleum, there were other outside influences. Lord Burlington, the young 4th Earl of Carlisle, these were both great enthusiasts for the new style of Palladian architecture, and Burlington's protege, Daniel Garrett. And the best way to understand how each of these men were involved in the design of the buildings and landscape is actually to look at their correspondence, and their correspondence has been published. Vanbrugh's letters were published in a handsome edition in the 1920s that's easily available, should be in a good library. And similarly, Hawksmoor's letters have been published in 2 editions. In a journal in the 1920s, all the letters relating to the mausoleum, and that shows how he was coming under pressure from Burlington and people to change the design. And a number of letters are also reproduced in the late Kerry Downes's scholarly monograph. If you want full imprint details of those, I can send them to you by email. So I hope that sort of begins to answer the question. There's no, I'm afraid, smoking gun document where the Earl says, I definitely want this and I definitely want it to look like that. You follow the kind of gestation of these buildings through things like the architect's letters, contemporary visitors' accounts, and actually the building account books too, which record the building work.
And we've had a question from Nicola and from Paul and Catherine, all asking the same thing, actually. Chris, where can we find the statue of Apollo that you referred to in the talk?
Right, it's easy to find. It's to the south side of the house. Basically, the simplest thing would be to go down the Lime Avenue, which is alongside the walled garden. The gateway into the walled garden is in that Lime Avenue. And right at the end of that avenue, in a terminal point, you will see that pyramid base with Apollo standing at the top of it. And as you get close to it, you'll think it's just standing on a kind of rudimentary heap of stones. But when you really get close up, you'll see that fantastic detail. So it's very simple to find in the south side of the house.
Thanks, Chris. And another question from Bob Gardner saying, was the lake always there?
I haven't touched on the lakes today, Bob. Sorry about that. I mean, there's a limit to what we can do in the time available. Now, the lakes, all of the lakes you see at Castle Howard, the South Lake and the Great Lake to the north, as well as the ponds and the rivers, these are all man-made features. The South Lake was designed in the 1720s. The Great Lake to the north was begun in the 1790s, and the configuration of ponds around it were altered in the 19th and 20th centuries too. And New River, as I said, was built in the 1730s. The fountains that you see today and the cascade and the waterfall, those are all 19th century additions by the Victorian landscape gardener, William Andrews Nesfield. And that whole later period of garden design and development is, I hope, going to be the subject of another talk in the future.
Thank you very much. Another question here from Nicola. Does anyone live in the gatehouse shown at the top of your screen? If not, what is it used for? And I think you actually lived in there yourself for a little bit at one point.
The gatehouse began life as an inn. When the wings were added in the 1750s, it was a hostelry, an inn. And it never seemed to be very successful. It was taken over by a succession of kind of proprietors, and it always seemed to struggle. They tried to combine running the inn with some of the adjacent farmland. At the end of the 19th century, it was used as a temperance inn for families from the urban districts of the West Riding. The 9th Countess would allow them to come and stay for summer holidays. And then in the 20th century, it was inhabited during the Second World War by the Howard family, who vacated the house when Queen Margaret's School had been evacuated there. And in the 1950s, briefly George Howard lived there, and then members of the family up until the end of the 1980s. Then it was lived in by the agent at Castle Howard, and I spent about 3 months living in there. On the, as you're looking at it on the screen today, on the right-hand compartment. The left-hand compartment is nearly derelict, having been damaged in a fire in the 1930s. I mean, it's still roofed, but empty inside. The eventual aim is to try and restore this building. It requires a lot of money to make it wind and watertight. And we've looked at various options, perhaps to turn it into a hotel or into offices. All of these things that need to be looked at very seriously. In terms of their economics, are they a viable proposition? But the idea is to bring that building back online when it becomes feasible to do so.
Thank you very much. Another question, are the pyramids just a fashion of the time, or do they have a greater meaning?
Well, pyramids, of course, begin life in Egypt. They migrate to Rome, and then, like a lot of architectural styles, they migrate further north into Europe and then eventually reaching England. Pyramids are kind of become very appealing to antiquarians and travelers in the 17th century. They're fascinated with their technology and also with what they mean, particularly as burial chambers for the pharaohs. In England, they have a variety of kind of associations and significances. Clearly, the big pyramid that Hawksmoor builds to the east of the gatehouse, that functions as a tomb in the sense that it has a representation of the family's great-great-great ancestor, Lord William Howard, from the 16th century. So in that respect, it is, if you like, a tomb, albeit with a sculpted representation of the member of the family inside it. The pyramid that you see on the top of the arch for the gatehouse in the middle of the screen at the moment, that was again initially built as a triumphal arch that evoked those arches that you would find in Rome. And that pyramid too is hollow, and that's how you get on the upper level from the left-hand side of the gatehouse to the right-hand side of the gatehouse. And inside that area, there's a rather wonderful little room that has water tanks and things in it. So it was a kind of practical space, as well as being a striking architectural kind of statement. There is, in fact, another solid pyramid even further east in Prettywood that Hawksmoor put up in the 1720s, very early 1730s too, but I haven't been able to show that in this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. And one more question here. Why was Rainwood cleared in the 1940s?
The reason it was cleared in the 1940s, I suspect, is that simply the wood was mature, or it was past maturity, but I dare say a lot of it could have been used for the war effort. So that's why it was clear felled and the timbers taken away, probably used for pit props in mining, all sorts of things to help the war effort. And so that hilltop was bare for about 20 years until it began to be replanted in the 1960s. And that has allowed us to reinstate some vision of those serpentine pathways that date from the 18th century.